A whisper in the night, a locked door no one could open, and a death that left not a single trace. Tonight a shadow has slipped silently into the heart of an English manor, and nothing will ever be the same. Secrets linger in every corner, and the answer is hidden where no one dares to look. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? Let me know in the comments below. The mystery begins now. It was upon a still and colourless evening in late October that I found myself once again ensconced in our sitting room at 221B Baker Street. The fire had settled into a red glowing heart of coals, and the lamplight threw long, drowsy shadows upon the wainscoted walls. Outside, the London fog pressed thickly against the window panes, curling and eddying like some silent phantom seeking entry. Holmes sat in his accustomed armchair, the long, slender frame of his body sunk deeply into the leather, his eyes half-lidded with indolence. He held his violin upon his knee, though no melody issued from it. Instead, he plucked at a single string absently, as though probing the boundaries of some private, inaudible rhythm. I had long since given up attempting to judge his moods. He might spend hours in such apparent torpor, only to leap, without warning, into a frenzy of deduction or movement. I recall thinking, as I perused the evening papers, that it was on just such evenings as these that the peculiar often made its entrance into our lives, quietly, like the fog itself. "Watson," Holmes said suddenly, without shifting his gaze from the fire, "what do you make of the gentleman who has just passed beneath our window?" I rose and peered through the lace curtain. A tall figure in a grey overcoat was making his way down Baker Street, leaning slightly to the left as he walked. "I saw only his back," I replied. "I might hazard that he is a professional man, perhaps a barrister, given the cut of his coat." Holmes gave a soft snort and set his violin gently aside. A barrister would not wear gaiters polished to such a dull gloss, nor would he carry a dispatch case fastened with a buckle worn smooth from sea air. "No, my dear Watson, that gentleman is a naval surgeon, recently invalided from Ceylon. His stoop comes not from age or injury, but from a long-standing bout of dysentery. The faint, chalky dust along the hem of his trousers suggests recent arrival via the Tilbury docks." I stared at him, mouth slightly ajar. "Holmes, you did not even look." "Reflection," he said simply, pointing to the silvered teapot on the tray beside him. "The handle provides a rather serviceable mirror of the street." He resumed his lazy posture, but a flicker of amusement danced at the edge of his lips. "One need not always face the world directly, Watson. Sometimes it is enough to see it sideways." Our brief interlude of deduction was interrupted by a rap at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered, bearing a telegram upon a small silver tray. "For you, Mr. Holmes," she said, her brow furrowed in that particular way, which denoted both curiosity and a hope she dared not speak aloud. Holmes took the envelope, slit it open with the edge of his violin bow, and scanned its contents. As he did so, the languor that had gripped him moments before fell away like a discarded coat. His brow furrowed. His eyes, always sharp, seemed to gleam with renewed purpose. "Curious," he murmured. "Quite curious." "What is it?" I asked, leaning forward. He handed me the telegram. It was from Inspector Lestrade, and its message was succinct. "Murder at Greystone Hall. Sir Edward Canley. Dead in locked study. No sign of wound or weapon. Please come." I read it twice before meeting Holmes's gaze. "No wound? No weapon?" "Exactly," Holmes replied, already rising to retrieve his coat from the peg. "And yet, the man is dead. That, Watson, is what makes this worthy of our attention." As he moved with brisk precision about the room, collecting his gloves and scarf, I felt the familiar thrill of mystery surge within me. The fog outside no longer seemed so grey. It had, once again, become the herald of intrigue. By the time the cab had been summoned, Holmes had resumed his more reflective demeanour, though I noted a subtle tension at the corners of his mouth, a tightness I had come to associate with the sharpening of thought. "There are few true mysteries left in this age, Watson," he remarked as we descended the stairs. "Most deaths that masquerade as puzzles are, upon inspection, disappointingly mechanical in origin: jealousy, inheritance, opportunity, poison. But a man found dead in a locked room, without wound or trace. Ah, that stirs the mind." "You think it could be natural causes?" I offered, though even as I said it, I felt the suggestion fall flat. Holmes shook his head. "Lestrade is many things, but he is not one to summon me over apoplexy or fainting spells. No, there is something else here. A hand unseen, a method unspoken." He paused at the threshold, glancing once into the fog-bound street beyond. "And those," he added quietly, "are the only cases worth pursuing." And with that, we stepped into the misty arms of night, the mystery of Sir Edward Canley waiting silently for us on the other side. It was scarcely 9:30 the next morning when a sharp knock echoed upon our sitting-room door. Holmes, who had been sifting through chemical residue in a series of test tubes with his usual detached intensity, called out for our visitor to enter. The door opened to reveal the familiar, wiry frame of Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard, his boots still flecked with mud from the previous night's rain, and his expression drawn with urgency. "Holmes," he began without preamble, "we have something very peculiar on our hands. I thought it best to bring it to you at once." Holmes inclined his head. "Pray, sit, Lestrade. I trust the morning's mystery is worth interrupting a rather promising compound." Lestrade took the offered chair but did not smile. "A man is dead. Sir Edward Canley of Greystone Hall, retired judge, found this morning slumped in his armchair, quite lifeless." "By what cause?" I asked. "That's just it, Doctor. There is no cause, no wound, no contusion, not a single mark. The study door was locked from the inside, windows barred, no sign of entry or struggle. It's as if the man simply ceased." Holmes folded his long fingers beneath his chin. "And the local physician?" "Baffled. Claims it might be a seizure or apoplexy, but even that rings hollow." Holmes's eyes narrowed with interest. "Then it would seem we are summoned to a scene where death has arrived with neither warning nor trace. Most intriguing indeed." "Sir Edward," Lestrade continued, "was well known at the bar. Harsh fellow. Built his reputation on swift judgments and rarely leaned toward mercy. Retired 5 years ago. Moved into Greystone Hall with his niece, Miss Clara Canley. No wife, no children. Just the girl and a skeleton staff." Holmes raised a brow. "Harshness in the courts often breeds bitterness outside them. Did he leave behind any notable enemies?" "Too many to list," Lestrade replied. "He handed down more death sentences than any judge in recent memory. But the timing's odd. No threats, no warnings, no disturbances. Just breakfast as usual, a closed study door, and silence until the housemaid found him hours later." "Describe the room," Holmes said. Lestrade leaned forward. "Standard sort of study. Heavy drapes, one large desk, bookshelves, decanter on the sideboard. The door was bolted from the inside, key still in the lock. The windows barred, iron fittings. When we forced the door, we found Sir Edward in his armchair by the fire. He hadn't fallen. He wasn't clutching his chest. Just seated. Head tipped slightly like he'd nodded off." Holmes drummed his fingers once against the armrest. "A judge who judged many, taken by death with no apparent agent. The law, Lestrade, may bind men, but death, it seems, moves with its own signature." "What struck me," Lestrade added, "was the decanter." Holmes looked up. "Ah?" "Port," said the inspector. The decanter had been shattered near the armchair, glass everywhere. No signs of a struggle, mind you, nothing else touched. And then there's the smell. I leaned forward. "The smell." Lestrade nodded. It was faint, mind, just a whiff. Something like wilted lilies, or perhaps bitter almonds, hard to place, gone by the time the coroner arrived. Holmes stood and moved to the mantel, lighting a cigarette with practiced ease. The presence of scent where none should linger is never to be overlooked, Lestrade. You are wise to take note. He turned to me. What do you make of it, Watson? Some chemical agent, perhaps, I replied. If it dissipated quickly, it could suggest a volatile compound, something inhaled rather than ingested. Precisely, Holmes murmured. The question, of course, is not merely what was introduced into that room, but how. In a sealed chamber with a single inhabitant, the delivery method becomes every bit as important as the poison itself. He turned to Lestrade. This scent? Was it floral? Acrid? Lestrade frowned. Neither. Sweet, but wrong. Like something that had died beneath perfume. Holmes extinguished his cigarette. Then we must go at once. Greystone Hall waits, and with it, the air that death has stirred. Before we could don our overcoats, the bell rang once more. Moments later, Mrs. Hudson returned with a young lady at her heels, pale, finely dressed, and visibly shaken. She could not have been more than 26, and though her bearing was upright, her eyes were rimmed with sleeplessness. Miss Clara Canley, Lestrade announced softly. Holmes stepped forward and gestured for her to sit. You are most welcome, though I suspect the circumstances are anything but. She nodded, clutching a handkerchief tightly. Inspector Lestrade informed me you had agreed to assist. I hoped, I might speak with you directly. You have suffered a grievous loss, I offered gently. Her eyes filled but did not spill. Yes, he was all the family I had left. And now, to lose him. And like this. Had your uncle been ill? Holmes asked. Number never better. He took port in the evenings and the Times in the mornings. He read aloud to me from Cicero only 2 nights ago. Any visitors recently? Letters? Signs of anxiety? She hesitated. No visitors, no change in his manner, but... Holmes leaned in. But... She lowered her voice. He did seem... reflective of late, as though something troubled him. He told me it was simply age and memory, but now I wonder. Holmes offered her a reassuring nod. You were right to come. If your uncle was taken by natural means, we shall know it. If not... His voice turned flint-like. Then so shall the one who made it appear so. Greystone Hall rose before us from a thin mist that clung to the hedgerows like a pale shawl. It was a bleak and angular residence, neither grand nor crumbling, but possessed of a sternness that matched what little I had gleaned of its late master. The gravel crunched sharply beneath the carriage wheels as we drew up to the front steps, where a liveried footman with sunken cheeks admitted us with solemn formality. Holmes said nothing during the ride, nor did he speak as we stepped into the main corridor. But I could feel his mind working beside me, sharp, alert, drawing lines between what was present and what was absent. The air inside the house bore that peculiar hush one associates with morning, but there was something taut beneath it, something that felt less like grief and more like held breath. Miss Clara Canley received us at the foot of the staircase, her composure slightly firmer than when we had last seen her. She offered brief introductions to the staff, an aging butler named Fenwick, a housemaid called Elsie, and the cook, who kept to the shadows and said nothing. It happened just through here, she said, leading us to a heavy oak door. Holmes nodded once and turned the handle, stepping over the threshold into the room where death had made no mark, but had made itself unmistakably known. The study was not large, but it bore the gravitas of a man who had once wielded authority as easily as others wielded a pen. Its furnishings were orderly and dark, mahogany shelves filled with legal texts, a fire grate still hosting a bed of ash, and a broad writing desk positioned beneath the window. now shuttered against the grey morning light. Sir Edward's armchair remained precisely as it had been described, angled slightly toward the hearth, as though he had turned to listen to the flames before surrendering to some final thought. Beside it, a side table stood askew, one of its legs resting in a shallow groove on the rug. The port decanter, I noted, had been replaced by a cloth-covered tray bearing remnants of glass. Holmes moved with a silent attentiveness I had come to admire, gliding from one item to the next without haste. He examined the latch on the inside of the door, which bore no sign of tampering, then knelt by the window and tested each of the iron bars. Not a hinge was loose. He turned next to the hearth, running a long finger across the soot, then lifting a pinch of ash to his nose before letting it fall. "There was no fire last night," he murmured, "but something warm passed through here this morning. Warm and fleeting." He stepped over to the desk and scanned its contents. Correspondence neatly stacked, ink well sealed, a blotter unmarked. No signs of haste, no visible alarm. "No struggle," Holmes said aloud. "No entry. No obvious method. But even silence, Watson, leaves footprints for those who know where to look." Holmes's gaze fell upon the edge of the rug, several paces from the side table. There, partially tucked beneath a tufted corner, lay a small object, transparent, with fractured edges. He retrieved it carefully with his handkerchief. "The glass," he said softly, "but not the one kept beside the decanter." I approached. The position of the glass struck me immediately. It was far from the tray, and out of reach from where Sir Edward had presumably sat. More curious still, it bore a faint ring at its base, as though it had been placed upon a different surface entirely, perhaps one recently wiped clean. Holmes then turned his attention to the back of the leather armchair. He bent low and ran a gloved hand along its rear panel. "See here," he said, indicating a narrow smear, brownish-grey, faint but not natural. "This was not dust, nor is it merely wear. Some substance, transferred perhaps in passing." I looked more closely. "Powdered residue?" "Possibly, but not in isolation. We must consider what it touched, and why it clung to this precise place." He straightened, his eyes gleaming. "The clues do not cry out, Watson, but they whisper. And it is in the whispers that murder often hides." Holmes turned next to the far corner of the room, where a cast-iron ventilation grate sat flush with the wainscoting, low to the floor and half obscured by a reading stand. He knelt, brushing aside the edge of the carpet with great care. I followed his motion and noted faint, repeated scuff marks on the wooden trim. "Someone has disturbed this vent recently," he said. "The marks are too deliberate to be the work of servants." He removed a small lens from his pocket and peered at the narrow lattice. After a moment, he retrieved a fine steel tool from his case and pried open the grate, revealing a small dust-lined channel leading into the wall beyond. "What is it?" I asked. He reached into the aperture with a thin probe, withdrawing it with a minute trace of yellowish powder upon the tip. Holmes sniffed it cautiously, then frowned. "Not sulphur," he murmured. "Not chalk. Something far less common." I bent low to observe. "You suspect the poison came through this?" "Not the poison," he said. "The means. Consider, Watson, the judge's death was not delivered by touch or taste, but by presence. A presence introduced here, dispersed subtly into the air." He rose and glanced once more about the chamber. "Which means," he concluded, "that the killer had access not to the man, but to the room and to the air he breathed." Holmes turned his attention next to the human elements of the household, whose subtleties often yielded more than the most elaborate of material clues. The butler, Fenwick, responded to our questions with all the stiff politeness of his office, yet his eyes seldom rose to meet those of my companion. His answers were brief, never more than required, and accompanied by a constant fidgeting of his gloved hands. When Holmes inquired as to the previous evening's routine, Fenwick described each detail with rehearsed precision, lighting the study fire, drawing the curtains, preparing Sir Edward's customary port. Yet at each mention of the study, his voice grew softer, as though uttering the word disturbed the very air. It was when Elsie, the housemaid, entered to clear the tea things that Holmes gently engaged her in conversation. She trembled as she placed a cup on the tray and dropped a spoon with a small clatter. Her responses were hurried and contradictory. She had seen Sir Edward retire early, but also that she'd glimpsed a light under his door past midnight. She had heard nothing, yet seemed haunted by the memory of distant footsteps. The colour left her cheeks as Holmes pressed no further, but the impression left upon us was unmistakable. A fear had taken root in the house, and whether it stemmed from guilt, knowledge, or some unspoken terror, I could not say. Yet Holmes, for all his delicacy, seemed to note every twitch and stammer. "Fear," he murmured as Elsie departed, "is rarely without cause, Watson. The question is, whose secret it is that walks these corridors?" As the afternoon waned, Holmes requested a second, more private conversation with Miss Clara Canley. She met us in the drawing-room, her composure steadier, yet a nervous tension showed in the way she twisted her handkerchief between gloved fingers. "Miss Canley," Holmes began with gentle gravity, "we must trouble you again for details that may, at first glance, seem of little import. Was there any occurrence in the days preceding your uncle's death which struck you as out of the ordinary?" She hesitated, her gaze drifting toward the fireplace. "There was a letter, anonymous, I believe. It arrived 3 days ago. I remember, because the post was otherwise empty. My uncle received it after breakfast and read it standing there, by the window. His face, it changed as he read. He grew so pale I thought he might faint. May I ask what became of the letter?" Clara's lips parted in a sigh. "He burned it at once, there, in the hearth. He did not speak a word. When I asked, he simply said it was the ghost of an old matter best consigned to ashes. He tried to laugh, but there was a tightness in his voice. I do not know what it contained, but from that moment he seemed different, quieter, as if some shadow from the past had come to rest upon his shoulder." Holmes regarded her with sincere sympathy, yet his eyes shone with intellectual fire. "And he told no one of its contents, not even you. Number he would not speak of it. I wish now that I had pressed him further." Holmes nodded, and as Clara excused herself, I saw that he was deep in thought. He glanced toward the cold hearth, where the last vestige of the letter's ashes had mingled with the morning's embers. "It is not only the living, Watson, who can send warnings," he said softly. "Sometimes the past itself finds a way to speak." When evening had crept into the corners of Greystone Hall and the household had retreated into uneasy silence, Holmes beckoned me into the study. He sat in Sir Edward's former armchair, legs crossed, fingers pressed together in his familiar attitude of concentration. I watched the lamplight trace his profile, the intensity of his gaze belying an outward calm. "Let us review, Watson," he began quietly. "We have a man, once a judge, whose professional life was steeped in the passing of sentence, often with a severity that must have sown grudges long and deep. He receives a letter, anonymous and troubling, which he destroys and refuses to discuss. Days later, he is found dead in a room, locked from within, without wound or apparent cause. He gestured to the scattered clues, the overturned glass, the faint smear upon leather, the powder at the vent, the scent of lilies, or death, still lingering. There is a design here, methodical, deliberate. The killer could not risk confrontation or suspicion. He relied on air, on time, on fear itself. This is no crime of passion, but one of calculation and patience." Holmes's voice dropped to a near whisper. But most telling of all is the silence that has enveloped the house, the secrecy, the fear, the guilt that clings like dust to every surface. Somewhere within that hush lies a motive born not of the present, but of a history none here yet dares to name. He turned his sharp eyes to me. We stand at the threshold, Watson, not only of this man's death, but of an older story. One written in justice, retribution, and, I suspect, a very personal kind of despair. Evening had cast long, angular shadows through the corridors of Greystone Hall when Lestrade, restless and with furrowed brow, sought us in the study. His patience, never inexhaustible at the best of times, had plainly worn thin under the pressure of a case that offered only riddles in place of answers. He spoke with a force that bespoke both his frustration and his professional need for resolution. "I'll be blunt, Holmes," he declared. "There is one in this house whose very presence is a question mark. Dr. Fellini, Miss Canley's suitor, Italian by birth, trained in Paris, dabbles in all manner of chemistry. He's the only man here who would know enough to use some foreign poison, and he's been about the place at odd hours." Holmes regarded Lestrade with that peculiar air of serenity which so often preceded the revelation of a deeper current. "And what motive do you ascribe to Dr. Fellini?" Lestrade's lips thinned. "He seeks to marry the niece, does he not? And perhaps the old man stood in his way. Stranger things have prompted murder, Holmes." Holmes merely nodded, his eyes slipping half shut in apparent assent. Yet I, who had studied those eyes so long, recognized a glimmer of polite skepticism. "Be cautious, Lestrade," he said softly. "In the search for foreign toxins, one might overlook the native wormwood that grows in every English hedge." For the remainder of the evening, Holmes betrayed none of his own conclusions. He sat quietly, turning the situation over and over in his mind, while Lestrade paced, and I did my best to find reason in a labyrinth of conflicting signs. Holmes spoke little, and when pressed for an opinion, he merely smiled, the expression enigmatic. There were moments, as the household gathered for supper, when I glimpsed him regarding Dr. Fellini with a gaze both searching and detached, as though appraising not the man, but the architecture of his soul. The Italian, for his part, maintained a dignity touched by sadness. His concern for Clara was genuine, his answers direct and unmarred by guile. It was only as the candles burned low and the company retired that Holmes confided to me, in tones barely above a whisper, "It is not always the foreigner who carries the most foreign design, Watson. Sometimes the darkest plots are sown in native soil, watered by memory rather than ambition." Holmes declared that he wished to remain at Greystone Hall for the night, a request met with weary acquiescence by both Lestrade and Miss Canley. He gave as his reason a vague wish to listen to the house breathe, as if the very walls might disclose secrets denied by their inhabitants. I knew, however, that there was purpose in his apparent indolence, a latent readiness that belied the languor of his words. Our quarters were prepared in the east wing, overlooking a frost-furred lawn and an avenue of ancient yews. Holmes, instead of retiring, moved silently about the corridors after the house had darkened, pausing now and then by certain doors, sniffing at a draught, running his fingers over a doorknob or a window latch. His eyes seemed drawn always to the spaces between things, the silent angles, the hollows beneath stairwells, the half-closed doors through which a single candle's flame might cast a nervous shadow. That night, I slept only in fitful intervals, my mind weighted with the strangeness of the house, and with the sense that Holmes, far from seeking rest, was waiting for the subtle cue that would quicken the chase anew. I was awakened just after midnight by Holmes's insistent whisper. His hand upon my shoulder was gentle, but his manner was urgent. "Watson, do you smell it?" he asked, barely above a breath. I sat up, senses prickling, and caught it. a faint aroma upon the air, unlike any perfume or cleaning agent I had known. It was sweet, almost sickly, touched by a note of decay. It lingered just at the threshold of perception, as if carried on some clandestine current from elsewhere in the house. "It's the same as in the study," I whispered. "How is it possible?" Holmes motioned for silence, then moved to the door, opening it the barest crack. He crouched, inhaling deeply, before nodding in satisfaction. "Air, Watson. It is the language of air that speaks most clearly in Greystone Hall tonight." He gathered his dressing gown and, without another word, led me into the shadowed corridor, drawn onward by the ghostly signature of scent that had begun this deadly affair. We trailed the elusive fragrance through deserted halls and down a narrow flight of stairs, Holmes moving with the purposeful caution of a hound upon the scent. The air grew colder as we entered the library, its windows rimed with dew and its shelves lined with volumes that seemed scarcely touched for decades. Holmes paused before a bookcase near the far wall. His fingers danced lightly across the spines until he pressed one, and with a muffled click, a portion of the shelving swung inward to reveal a narrow cavity. Within, neatly stacked yet powdered with age, lay a bundle of legal papers tied in faded blue ribbon. Holmes drew out the packet, his face unreadable as he thumbed through the yellowing sheets. "Old cases," he muttered, all bearing Sir Edward's hand. "But here, this is what we seek." He held up a single file, distinct from the rest by virtue of its worn cover and the sombre weight with which he regarded it. "The name," Holmes said quietly, "will be familiar to none but those who have walked through the shadows of English justice." He handed the file to me, and I read the name scrawled upon its cover in an unsteady hand: Harold Vane. The brief notations inside chronicled the life and trial of a man condemned for murder more than 12 years prior, a case notorious in its day for the public outcry that followed the verdict. Holmes turned pages with meticulous care, pointing out certain passages, Sir Edward's personal remarks upon the evidence, the dissent of a single juror, the final appeal denied without explanation. "Harold Vane maintained his innocence to the end," Holmes observed, yet Sir Edward was unwavering in his judgment. "What does this mean?" I asked. Holmes's gaze was grave. "It means, Watson, that our present crime is rooted in a past injustice, or the perception of one. Someone has gone to extraordinary lengths to punish a judge, not for what he did yesterday, but for a verdict delivered a lifetime ago." He tucked the file beneath his arm. "Come, Watson. The question is no longer how Sir Edward died, but whose hand returned to settle an old score, one written in the silent ink of revenge." As we slipped back into the hush of the house, I felt the full measure of unease settle upon me. The spectre of Harold Vane, long since buried by the law, had returned to walk the halls of Greystone Hall, and with it the promise of revelation and of danger yet to come. It was shortly after breakfast, with an uneasy hush lingering over Greystone Hall, when a piercing shriek shattered the brittle calm. Elsie, the housemaid, had descended to the wine cellar at Fenwick's behest, only to return moments later in a state of breathless terror. At Holmes's urging, we hurried below, our footsteps echoing in the cold gloom. There, sprawled upon the rough stone, lay Fenwick, the butler, his complexion ashen, breath shallow, and eyes fluttering with the fevered confusion of a man adrift between sleep and death. A faint, sweet odour, so like that which had haunted Sir Edward's study, hovered in the stale air. Holmes knelt and pressed 2 fingers to the man's pulse, then motioned for Lestrade to summon a physician. The cellar was undisturbed, no sign of violence, no displaced casks, no broken glass. I searched for the usual stigmata of apoplexy, but found only a subtle dilation of the pupils and the telltale languor that now connected the fate of Fenwick to that of his master. Holmes regarded the walls, sniffing at a draught that crept from beneath a stack of crates, his eyes narrowing with calculation. The servants, clustered at the threshold, looked on with faces drawn and silent. Whatever had claimed Sir Edward in secret now threatened the living, and fear spread through the house like a shadow deepening with every uncertain breath. Holmes rose from Fenwick's side, his expression set and decisive. "No one is to remain below stairs," he announced, his voice ringing through the stone passages, with a clarity that brooked no argument. "Gather what you require and come above. This house is no longer safe for its inhabitants." There was a moment's hesitation, as if even the walls themselves recoiled at his command, then a scurrying of feet as the staff hurried to obey. Miss Clara, white-faced but composed, led Elsie and the cook into the morning room, while Lestrade saw to the positioning of the remaining staff. "Fear, Watson," Holmes said quietly, "may be the killer's most potent accomplice. But today, we arm ourselves with prudence rather than bravado." He swept his gaze across the emptying corridors. "Danger still stalks these rooms, but it must do so without audience. Let us remove the innocents, and with them, any further opportunity for calamity." His words left no room for doubt. Something unseen had been loosed upon Greystone Hall, and only the most methodical vigilance could prevent its silent advance. As the household emptied, Holmes drew Lestrade aside and led him into the gardens that stretched behind the hall. There, hidden among tangled ivy and frost-browned shrubs, was the exterior mouth of the ventilation system Holmes had earlier investigated. "Post a constable here," Holmes instructed. "No one, under any pretext, is to approach this vent, nor tamper with it, however innocent their purpose may seem." Lestrade, to his credit, did not question the directive. He dispatched a uniformed man who, rifle in hand, took up a silent vigil by the iron grate. I could see the wheels turning in Holmes's mind, the alignment of airflow, the dispersal of a subtle poison, the means by which death entered unseen. He knelt by the vent, scraping away a fine residue that clung to the rim, and studied it with grave intensity. "The air, Watson," he murmured. "It is the one visitor to every room, the only guest who requires neither invitation nor passage. The poison rides its breath, and in so doing evades every bolt and bar." Holmes straightened, resolve hardening in his countenance, and led the way back toward the house, determined to solve the puzzle that was fast unravelling into tragedy. We returned to the study, the room that now seemed the sombre heart of all that had transpired. Holmes paced its length, his steps measured, his gaze flickering between the grate, the decanter, and the faded smear on the armchair. He spoke in a voice both calm and chilling in its precision. "Note, Watson, the consistency of events. A sealed room. Victims isolated. The onset swift, the aftermath without struggle. In each case, the scent is both messenger and signature, a clue both overlooked and inescapable." He lifted the glass again, holding it to the lamplight. Here, a single vessel removed from its kin. And there, on the chair, residue, but of what? Not mere dust, but a trace of what killed not by blade, nor by bullet, but by breath. I watched as Holmes sifted the powder between his fingertips, his eyes narrowing in calculation. The method is elegant in its horror, an agent so rare and volatile that only a mind versed in both chemistry and vengeance could wield it. It was introduced not by hand, but by air, delivered not to the body, but to the lungs. A shudder passed through me as the scope of the plan became clear. The killer had not merely sought to evade detection, but to redefine the very nature of murder. This was no crime of opportunity, but of the most chilling design. The cry came from the upper floors, sudden and strangled, a note of terror that drew us all in a rush to the servants' quarters. There, behind a door bolted from within, we forced our way into a small chamber and found Elsie, the young housemaid, lifeless upon her narrow bed. There was no violence to her repose. She seemed to have surrendered to sleep, her features composed, yet with the same pallor and slight dilation of the eyes that had marked both Sir Edward and the butler. A sickly trace of the familiar scent lingered near her pillow, dissipating even as we entered. Holmes examined the room with relentless care, testing the window, scrutinizing the door. "Locked," he said. "No sign of entry, no struggle, no cause." The tragedy struck all present with fresh horror. Miss Clara, who had come to depend upon Elsie's gentle presence, collapsed in silent grief. Even Lestrade, so often a figure of unyielding purpose, appeared shaken by the relentless logic of death's advance. Holmes laid a hand upon my shoulder. "She knew," he said, voice grave. "She saw or sensed something, and for that she has been silenced. The killer acts not only to achieve, but to conceal. The pattern, Watson, grows ever darker." In the echoing silence that followed, I watched Holmes as he stood in the doorway, his profile etched against the gloom. There was no boast in his posture, no trace of satisfaction, only a tightening resolve, a gathering of intellectual force. "The murderer walks among us still," he murmured, barely audible above the hush of grief. "With each step, he has grown more confident, more audacious, hiding in plain sight and striking with impunity." I felt a chill that owed nothing to the cold of the hallways. Holmes's eyes, dark and unblinking, fixed upon a point beyond my comprehension, already turning over the possibilities, assembling a trap whose workings only he could fully discern. I knew then that he would not rest, not until the invisible hand that had brought death to Greystone Hall was laid bare beneath the hard light of truth. Holmes summoned me to the deserted study in the hush that followed the maid's tragic demise. The fire burned low, casting restless shadows on his sharpened features as he laid out, in measured tones, the mechanism by which murder had slipped past our very senses. "Consider, Watson," he began, "the distinctive, persistent scent at every fatal scene, and its uncanny propensity to vanish within moments. No conventional poison would behave so, unless, of course, it were formulated for inhalation, not ingestion." He paused, allowing the weight of the thought to settle. "The powder at the vent and the faint yellow trace, these are not the detritus of common dust. I believe we are dealing with an extract of Flor del Muerto, the flower of the dead, a plant found only in the darkest jungles of South America. Its vapors, when distilled and deployed with precision, bring a sleep from which there is no waking, all without violence or visible stain." He showed me a crude sketch, a glass atomizer such as one might use for scenting linen. Such a device, adapted to the vent, would send a fatal cloud into the air, dissipating within minutes, killing the chosen, sparing the rest. The realization struck me cold. Our murderer had weaponized air itself, turning breath into a silent harbinger of death. Holmes moved to the window, observing the frost on the glass and the subtle drift of air around the frame. "Timing, Watson, is the murderer's silent accomplice. The study's vent opens to the prevailing breeze, and the poison, introduced in the night, rides its current to the chair where Sir Edward sat. He traced with his finger the route the air must have taken, and I saw anew the design. How a draught, invisible to sight, could ferry death past every lock and bolt. The choice of a floral agent was deliberate. Its fragrance, while distinct, would be dismissed as cologne or a bouquet. The residue upon the chair, left by contact with the atomizer, served only to disguise, never to reveal. Holmes's eyes glinted in the firelight. Thus, the crime is rendered invisible. A murder with no weapon, no wound, no cry. Only a whisper remains, scented and swift. Few would believe such a method possible, and yet here we stand in the wake of its deadly logic. Having untangled the method, Holmes's gaze sharpened with that peculiar blend of pity and ruthlessness that marked his finest stratagems. We must draw our adversary into the open, Watson, for he is at once cunning and desperate, a mind that will not rest while any threat to his concealment remains. He withdrew from his breast pocket a letter, sealed and inscribed in a neat, legal hand. I have composed this in the character of a provincial solicitor. It informs Miss Canley that further documents relating to Sir Edward's old verdicts have surfaced, documents which may well change the perception of his final years. Holmes studied the fire for a moment before continuing. The killer has acted with extraordinary care to ensure every secret stays buried. The suggestion of undisclosed papers will be irresistible, a bait he cannot ignore. He must act swiftly to retrieve or destroy them, and in so doing, reveal himself. His confidence reassured me, though I could not help but feel the gravity of the risk to Clara, whose innocence now became the unwitting fulcrum of justice. In the quiet hours of early evening, Holmes placed the letter upon the polished surface of the drawing-room table, making no effort to disguise it. Instead, he ensured it lay where any attentive eye, servant or guest, would be sure to notice its presence. The seal caught the lamplight, and beside it, Holmes left a sheaf of blank legal paper, as if to suggest a cache of sensitive correspondence. We retired to a vantage point just beyond the threshold, hidden by a shadowed alcove. Holmes's manner was all composure, though the stillness in his posture betrayed the tension beneath. The house itself seemed to hold its breath as, one by one, the inhabitants drifted through, none so much as pausing until, at last, a hesitant figure lingered. A hand reached for the envelope, examined it, replaced it. The glance cast over the shoulder was sharp, furtive, then vanished into the gloom. "The bait has been noticed," Holmes whispered, eyes alight with anticipation. "Now, Watson, we must trust to human nature's inevitable impatience." Night descended upon Greystone Hall with an unnatural heaviness, as though every room were muffled by secrets. Holmes led me, silent as a wraith, to the passage outside Clara's chamber. There we waited, pressed into the gloom, our ears straining for the smallest hint of movement. Time slowed to a painful crawl, marked only by the distant ticking of a clock and the faintest rustling from the rooms below. I confess my nerves were drawn as taut as wire. In that hush, every floorboard's creak and every sigh of wind seemed a summons to disaster. Holmes, by contrast, appeared carved from stone, his eyes sharp, his breath even. He held in his hand not a revolver, but a slim file of notes, the true weapon of a mind that had already mapped the murderer's path. It was, I realized, a battle not of brute strength, but of intellect and anticipation. At last, as the clock in the distant hall chimed 3, Holmes stirred, raising a finger to his lips. "It is nearly time," he breathed, and together we listened to the approach of fate, footstep by careful footstep, on the other side of the door. The silence fractured at precisely 17 minutes past 3. A soft scraping, a key turned in a lock, a door eased open. Through the faintest gap, I discerned the silhouette of a man slipping into Clara's room, his posture low, movements deliberate. He carried in his hand a glass vial, stopper glinting in the lamplight, and with a skill that bespoke familiarity, he moved to the fireplace, knelt, and reached for the vent. Holmes moved with the swiftness of a striking hawk. In an instant, the corridor was filled with light and the sound of a cry torn from the throat of a man who had believed himself invisible. Holmes seized his wrist, twisting the vial from his grasp, while I rushed forward to assist. The man struggled, his face twisted with fear and fury, but Holmes's grip was implacable. "Enough," he said, his voice cold as the stones beneath our feet. "You have done your last harm at Greystone Hall." Lestrade, roused by the commotion, burst into the room and took charge of the captive, whose protests now rang hollow. Clara, awakened by the noise, stared in bewilderment as the veil of terror that had smothered the house was at last torn away. Holmes straightened, eyes fixed on the trembling figure. "The ghost of justice, Watson, is sometimes more terrible than the crime itself. Now let us see whose mask we have torn aside tonight." In the stark gaslight that now flooded Clara's chamber, the intruder's features, previously so ordinary, so easily overlooked among the staff, became fixed with the desperate pallor of a hunted animal. Lestrade, his professional composure restored, secured the man's wrists, while Holmes, cool and unwavering, regarded him with a mixture of pity and condemnation. I recognized him at last, the under-footman, who had kept so unremarkable a presence as to become part of the very fabric of the house. His hands, though roughened by menial labour, trembled now as Holmes drew the attention of all present. "Let us speak plainly," Holmes said. "You are not who you have pretended to be. Your name, if I am not mistaken, is Vane, James Vane, son of Harold Vane, once condemned at the bar of English justice." The man met Holmes's gaze, the mask of servility slipping from his face, replaced by a haunted defiance. For a moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the rattling breath of a spirit cornered at last by truth. Holmes continued gently, "Your sister, the maid Elsie, knew the truth, did she not? It was fear, not guilt, that kept her silent, and it is that same fear which, in the end, betrayed you to justice." The man's resolve collapsed, and with it came a torrent of confession, low at first, then building with the force of a life's grievance. "He sent my father to the scaffold," he choked, "for a crime he did not commit. All my life I have carried the weight of that injustice, the memory of my father's pleas echoing in my dreams. Sir Edward Canley, his word was law, and he showed none." Tears stood in his eyes, not for his own sake, but for a father lost to the machinery of judgment. "I vowed long ago that I would make him feel what we had felt. Fear, helplessness, the chill of death at the door. I became a servant in his house. I waited, watched. My sister, she did not know at first. When she found out, she begged me to let the past lie, but it was too late. Vengeance had become the blood in my veins." Holmes listened with the gravity such wounds demanded, his features grave. Revenge, once loosed, cares little for innocence or guilt. It is a chain, binding all who touch it. "Flor del muerto," he muttered almost reverently. "I learned of it from an old sailor on the docks, a poison that kills without a trace. I fashioned an atomizer and filled it with the extract, waiting for the night Sir Edward would take his port alone. I shattered the decanter so the scent would be masked, and then, while he dozed in his chair, I released the vapour through the vent. He died as my father did, alone, with justice unhearing. There was a terrible poetry to his method, as if he sought not merely death, but a silent testament. He trusted the law and his locked door to keep him safe, but the air itself became the instrument of retribution. I left no mark, only the memory of a judgment reversed. He bowed his head, grief flickering at the edges of his voice. Elsie, my sister, she was never meant to suffer. She found the atomizer hidden in the scullery, guessed its purpose, and confronted me. I begged her to say nothing, but she was terrified. She threatened to tell Miss Canley, and I panicked. I tried to warn her to remove the evidence, but the residue proved fatal when she examined it too closely. A hush fell over the assembled witnesses, each weighed down by the tragedy that had unfolded among them. even Holmes, so often insulated against the anguish of crime, regarded the wretched man with a compassion rarely glimpsed. "Vengeance," Holmes said quietly, "is never a single blade. It wounds those who wield it as surely as those it seeks." When at last we found ourselves once more within the warm precincts of Baker Street, a hush descended that was at once a balm and a burden. Holmes sat in his accustomed chair, eyes fixed upon the shifting embers of the hearth, while the ceaseless London fog pressed its spectral fingers against the window panes. I, weary in mind and body, felt the strange, familiar disquiet that always accompanied the closing of such a case, a mingling of relief and sorrow, as though justice, in being served, had also left a mark upon those who served it. We had returned from Greystone Hall changed, each bearing the weight of secrets unmasked, destinies irrevocably altered. Holmes began, in his precise fashion, to draw the tangled skein of evidence into order. "It was the scent that first troubled me, Watson, a fragrance at once foreign and fleeting, present in every death. The air vent was the next link, an unobtrusive means of entry that could carry the agent to its intended victim. The powder, the overturned glass, the residue upon the chair, each pointed to the use of an atomizer, a device that could transform a rare toxin into an invisible weapon, swift and indiscriminate." He tapped his fingers against the arm of his chair. "Locked doors are meant to keep danger out, but in this case, they locked death in. The killer needed no blade, no physical strength, only patience, chemistry, and a heart fueled by long-nursed resentment. The act was at once brutal and coldly intellectual, the work of a mind shaped by loss and embittered by years of injustice. The sequence, so labyrinthine at first, revealed itself in the logic of Holmes's narration, a design as elegant as it was terrible. "It was Elsie's behaviour that most perplexed me," Holmes continued. "Her fear was not the guilt of complicity, but the knowledge of a secret too dreadful to speak aloud. She discovered the atomizer, perhaps suspected its true purpose, and was caught between loyalty to her brother and horror at the path he had chosen. It was not her own crime that haunted her, but the impending certainty that evil, once unleashed, would consume more than its intended prey. I remembered the young woman's trembling hands and haunted eyes, and realised with fresh ache that innocence had been one of the killer's casualties. Fear, Watson, may keep a secret, but it cannot shield the soul from its consequences." Holmes sat in silent thought for some minutes before speaking. "There is, I think, a chasm between the justice sought in courts and the justice demanded by the heart. Sir Edward judged men by the letter of the law, believing the edifice of society rested on impartial sentence. Yet in the dark, neglected corners of those verdicts, seeds of bitterness take root." He looked at me, the firelight glinting in his eyes. "When the law falls silent, vengeance fills the void, a shadow that creeps quietly, patient for years. Our killer was forged not merely by his father's fate, but by a world unwilling to listen after the gavel's fall. In seeking to right a wrong, he became the very thing he despised, a judge, a jailer, and, at last, an executioner." There was sorrow in Holmes's voice, a recognition that some wounds, left untended, fester into tragedies neither law nor logic can fully redeem. My thoughts turned to Miss Clara Canley, whose suffering had run silent and deep beneath the house's tumult. She bore her loss with a dignity that did not disguise her pain, a grief compounded by the knowledge that the trusted walls of her home had sheltered both a friend and a murderer. Her world, once governed by habit and familial affection, now lay in fragments, and I wondered if she would ever again find peace in the halls of Greystone Hall. Some betrayals leave no visible scar, but shape the heart forever. You anticipated every move, I said quietly, unable to mask my admiration. It was not only logic that caught the killer, Holmes, but an understanding of grief, pride, and fear, forces more subtle than any poison. Holmes dismissed the compliment with a faint gesture. Perhaps, Watson, but let us not romanticize our part in it. Even the purest truth, if wielded without care, may wound those it seeks to heal. We are instruments, not arbiters, and it is for others to determine how justice should be remembered. He leaned back, eyes once more fixed on the flames, and I sensed that even now, the story had not quite loosened its hold upon him. In the quiet, I found myself pondering the cost of every answer and the shadows that always lingered beyond the reach of reason. There is a peculiar hush that settles over Baker Street in the wake of a case concluded. A silence that is not so much absence of sound as it is the residue of spent emotion. The city outside resumes its ceaseless hum, yet within the sanctuary of our rooms, I often find myself haunted by the echoes of suffering and the fragile peace restored. Holmes would return to his armchair, a cigarette between his slender fingers, while I sat opposite him, pen in hand, searching for words to set order to the chaos we had witnessed. This latest affair left a particular heaviness in its wake, one that did not easily disperse with the dawn. I found myself turning over the details in my mind, the haunted faces at Greystone Hall, the twisting labyrinth of motive and memory, the awful quiet of the rooms where death had come and gone without a trace. It was as though a shadow lingered, stubbornly resisting the pale comfort of victory. And I wondered, as I often did, what it meant to chase evil out of its hiding places, only to discover its cost in the hearts of those left behind. Holmes, for his part, seemed unusually subdued in the aftermath. His eyes, so often bright with the thrill of deduction, appeared veiled by a kind of inward fatigue, as though the revelations of the case had pressed upon his spirit more deeply than he cared to admit. He sat for long stretches in silence, regarding the fire with a sombre gravity, the smoke of his cigarette tracing aimless patterns in the air. I saw in him, not for the first time, the lonely burden of his craft, to see so clearly the darkest motives of men and yet remain untouched by cynicism or despair. There was, on that evening, a particular stillness in his posture, a quiet that spoke not of rest, but of resignation to the eternal struggle between justice and the passions that defy it. He looked up at me once, and I fancied that for a fleeting moment, I glimpsed in his gaze the melancholy of a soul too finely tuned to the sorrows of the world, a weariness not of mind, but of heart. And yet he offered no complaint, only the faintest of smiles before turning back to the flickering coals. It was Holmes who broke the silence at last, his voice emerging from the shadows with a rare note of introspection. "We spend our days in pursuit of shadows, Watson," he mused, "and we pride ourselves on bringing light to the darkest corners. But there are times, like these, when I wonder if it is the light itself that is the heavier burden." I listened, recognizing in his words the echo of all we had endured, the calculated cruelty of vengeance, the aching aftermath of loss, the uneasy knowledge that truth, once revealed, is not always a balm, but sometimes a blade. Holmes leaned forward, his fingers steepled before him, eyes reflecting the golden firelight. "The difficulty is not the chase," he continued softly, "but what we see when the light finally lands. We find the culprit, yes, and the mechanism by which he worked his harm. But we also find wounds in the living that cannot be closed by justice alone. In such moments, I confess, I envy the blind, who are spared the sight of what lies beneath the surface of our fellow men." His words fell between us, not as cynicism, but as the honest reckoning of a mind attuned to darkness and to the painful illumination that follows its dispersal. As the hours wore on and the fire dwindled to embers, I found myself reflecting on the invisible scars left by this singular case. The murder with no weapon had been, in truth, an act carried out with tools subtler than any knife or pistol, an old grievance, a wounded soul, and the air itself pressed into the service of revenge. Yet what lingered most was not the method, ingenious as it was, but the injuries unseen. Clara Canley's sorrow, Elsie's loyal heart forever silenced, Holmes's own quiet suffering at the knowledge of evils that could neither be wholly explained nor wholly expiated. I closed my notebook with a sense that justice had, at best, restored only a part of what had been lost. Of all our adventures, this was one of the few where even Holmes admitted the weapon was not the only thing that had gone unseen. Some mysteries remain, not in the evidence, but in the hearts of those who must endure their consequences, long after the game is declared won and the culprit unmasked. And so, the fog returned to Baker Street, the world outside unchanged, while within we sat a little quieter, marked by the shadows that are never entirely banished by the dawn. As the evening deepened and the last embers faded in the hearth, Holmes sat in contemplative silence, the shadows flickering across his sharp features. At length he turned to me, his gaze thoughtful. "You see, Watson, it is not always the weapon we must fear, but the wound left unseen. In our pursuit of justice, we so often seek the obvious, while the true harm lies hidden, in the secrets men bury and the lengths to which they'll go to keep them concealed. The invisible is always the most perilous." He paused, his expression both grave and quietly triumphant. "It is a curious thing, is it not, that the deadliest of mysteries are so often carried on the very air we breathe? Now I turn to you, dear listener. What do you think was the criminal's greatest error, trusting in the silence of old secrets, or underestimating the mind that hunts in shadows? Share your theory in the comments below. I'm eager to hear your deduction. If you enjoyed unravelling this case, don't forget to comment your thoughts, subscribe for more Sherlock Holmes mysteries, and share this story with fellow lovers of the curious and the uncanny. Until our next adventure, keep your eyes sharp and your mind ever curious.